Hello and welcome to week 4, where we will turn our attention towards bounded awareness. No pun intended with that statement, but this is a topic that, just like so many others we've covered in the textbook, that we can really all relate to. We've all been in this situation where we're staring right at something and yet we don't see it until someone comes along and points it out to us. I know this happens to me every time I open the refrigerator to get something out for my wife and can't locate it. And it's very similar, as the textbook pointed out, to the availability heuristic. The major difference here would be that bounded awareness is more about what we're focused on, the focal point of our decision making or our attention or whatever it may be. Whereas the availability heuristic is more about depending too much on the information that's already readily available, things that we're already aware of. So be sure to understand that distinction when you're talking about this. But again, you're not going to be tested in this class on identifying those specifically, but you may be using these different concepts in your paper, so be sure to define them well in order to make the best sense and best use of your papers. Speaking of that, in week 4, you ought to be working on your written assignment that is due in week 5, and so make sure you're setting aside ample time this week to be working on that. And you'll see that you have a limited number of videos and that sort of thing this week, so that you can have extra time to be working on those papers. So much like a lot of the heuristics that we talked about, I want to encourage you not to think of bounded awareness as necessarily a negative thing always. In fact, it's a blessing in a lot of ways when we really begin to understand its purpose. We need to be aware of it. We need to be aware of the limitations. We need to realize that this is a universal phenomenon that individuals in every culture have to be aware of, or at least they're functioning within these restraints of bounded awareness, because that's how we've been designed. We need to be aware so that we can make better decisions and not rely too heavily on the things that we perceive. But we can also appreciate the fact that God has designed our God has designed our brains with this innate ability to filter out things that we don't need to focus on, or things that we don't want to focus on. Imagine how exhausting life would be if you gave equal attention to every single variable that's going on in your very busy life. If you had to process every movement and every color and every object that's within your visual sensory landscape, that would just be overwhelming. You wouldn't get anything else done. And then you multiply that with all of your other senses. If you had to process every single thing going on around you with equal focus, then obviously we wouldn't get anything done. And maybe one day in heaven, in our glorified bodies, we'll have the ability to be able to process more. Well, I'm sure we'll process more information, and maybe do so in a way that we can't even imagine in this life. But while we're limited here on the earth, we've got limited time, we've got limited resources, and one of those resources is your cognitive ability. And so we can be thankful for this bounded awareness and learn to manage it within our lives, and learn to manage it within our organizations, as we're focused on a little bit more in this class, of how that impacts our leadership of other individuals. When we lead others, it's helpful to know that we have this potential blind spot in our decision making and our perspectives and perception of things, but we also should be aware that our those that we're serving, those that we're supervising, they have the very same limitations, and we shouldn't come down on them so hard. For example, when they miss an obvious point, that we look at it and say, well, how did you not see this? We need to understand that bounded awareness is a reality that all of us have, and we can help train them so that they are more focused on the things that are important, so that they won't be blind to that particular thing in the future. But of course, that means they'll be blind to other things because they have limited capacity, limited bandwidth. And those are important tools for us to think about, or important concepts for us to think about as we manage and lead other individuals. So this concept of inattentional blindness is really the one I was alluding to in the opening slide, talking about opening the refrigerator door, looking for the mayonnaise swearing that there's no mayonnaise in the refrigerator because I've looked on every shelf, and then suddenly finding out that it's right there in front of me in a big giant white bottle. We've experienced that. And the textbook says that people have a tendency not to see what they are not looking for, even when they are looking directly at it. Now, I'm looking for the mayonnaise, yet somehow, unconsciously, I'm not looking for that particular shape, that particular object, or that particular color for whatever reason. That seems impossible when we're talking about mayonnaise, but you've experienced that. Your brain has something else in mind. Maybe you expected it to be in the door, but yet it was on a shelf. And so that disjointedness in our thinking caused us to be blind to something that was right there in front of us. And so that brings us to a really important practical piece of this that comes up in the video that you'll see later from one of the experts that's out there on bounded awareness and how bounded awareness really impacts our ethical choices and our rational thinking. But she mentions that bounded awareness is not just a failure to see, but it's a combination with a failure to seek. And so a lot of times, and this is where it becomes frustrating for a spouse who's saying, I can't see it, and the other person's telling them it's right there, is because sometimes it's because we're really not putting forth the effort or the focus to seek out that thing that we're not able to see. And so we might have more on our mind, we might have had a difficult day at work, and we've got a lot of things processing through our brain at the moment, and so we're not seeking the thing that we really thought we were seeking. We were seeking some kind of solution rather than the actual jar of mayonnaise or whatever it may be. Obviously, that's a little bit of a silly example, but you can see how this could turn into much bigger issues within our organizations, within our ministries, and so on, if we're not really seeking the answers, if we're not seeking the evidence or the information that would really be helpful for a particular decision. And as we've seen in some of the other reading, a lot of times we as humans don't seek out information that would contradict the things that we're hoping to find, or we don't seek out the things that don't agree with our preconceived notions and so forth. And so all of those tendencies lead us toward a real blindness that can be very dangerous and certainly undermine our ability to make good decisions and undermine our ability to lead others towards good decisions. And that's a good segue to this next point that I wanted to mention, and that is what the textbook calls change blindness. We are very aware sometimes of other people's changes and maybe even changes in our environment, but we're rarely aware of the changes going on in our own lives, our own character or behavior or spiritual growth and those sort of things, because the change is so slow. At least in our perspective, we're aware of lots of things going on in our life, and so when we look at maybe change over the last month, it's so incremental that we don't notice how different things are from just a month ago in our own life. When we see someone that we haven't seen for a while, we see the change because the last time I saw them, it was this way. Then I saw them, they were this way. Classic example would be a child that's growing. You don't see them for 2 months and you're shocked at how tall they are 2 months later, but they don't notice it because they look at themselves every day in the mirror and they don't see the change. So again, that translates into organizational behavior and into organizational leadership. So where it really becomes important, especially for those of us who are representing Christ in our leadership roles, we need to be aware of how this can impact us when it comes to ethical and moral decline that we all are prone to. And so we should be alert to what the textbook and many of us have referred to in our past as slippery slopes. We look at certain decisions and say, well, that might be a slippery slope towards some kind of compromise or ethical, poor ethical decisions and so on. And so always remember that boiling frog metaphor. And I've heard that growing up in countless sermons and didn't realize until I read this textbook that that's just folk wisdom or folklore and probably isn't exactly how things would work with a frog in the lab. But it's an important metaphor for us to remember. And that is that slow change over time could lead to real destruction, real problems. And yet we might be blind to it because of that that slow incremental change that's leading us towards that new direction. Change, of course, can be in the positive direction, but oftentimes as humans, it's in the negative direction. And so that's one of the great functions of the design of the church and the body of Christ, and so that there's accountability and there's edification going on, and there's a rebalancing constantly of getting our perspectives realigned and where they should be. But that's also true in other realms of our life, where we should keep people close to us in our businesses and our work. We should have people close to us who would give us honest and sometimes painful feedback about things that they're observing, changes that they see going on in our life, that just maybe our demeanor, maybe our attitude, maybe the time we show up at work, and maybe the amount of energy that we're putting into certain things. It's wise for anyone to keep someone close to them that would keep them honest, not just people that will tell you what you want to hear. That's lots of research out there will show you that will lead towards poor leadership and an organizational failure when you have nothing but always positive feedback from those around you. So locate those individuals who will be honest and ask them to do so. Ask them to keep you accountable. Ask them to point out the changes that they may be observing, and do the same for them. That's in an organizational setting, that can be through the use of annual assessments, like an annual review of an employee and so on. But it can also be informal through just companionship and praying together or meeting together and making sure that there are open lines of communication along these lines. And the writer of Proverbs says it this way: faithful are the wounds of a friend, but deceitful are the kisses of an enemy. And that's such an important concept for us to learn as leaders, especially when we realize that we are so blind to our own decline, and that we have this bounded awareness, especially regarding things that we're not looking for. And within our organizational settings, we often function in groups. We have meetings of department heads or a committee or a certain ad hoc team to address a certain situation. And those groups are typically designed so that we'll have multiple perspectives and different opinions and lots of information coming to the table, so that all of these different factors can be considered, and so that we're not just relying on our own individual perception of things or own individual ideas or experiences. And so that's the benefit of a group situation. However, the research that the textbook mentioned shows that all too often those groups are limited by this bounded awareness that occurs even in group settings. And the way it plays out there many times is that the group ends up talking about just the things that everyone sitting around the table already knew. And there's a lot of this reinforcing of the things that we all agree on, which is not very helpful. We want to have something brought to the table that none of us have thought of before, or we didn't want to think about because of our own desire to seek out the things that affirm our own beliefs or affirm where we're hoping this decision will end up. But the best decisions are typically made when we have at least a devil's advocate voice in the room. And sometimes it's good to assign someone that position, even if they want to choose option A. Encourage some of them to push for option B in the meeting, not deceitfully or anything like that. Just ask them, if you needed to defend option B, how would you do so? And that formulates some creative thinking and so on that helps overcome this limit of bounded awareness within a group setting. And so always invite that feedback and do everything you can to avoid just another meeting that will do nothing more than reinforce and entrench us in what we already think. Because when you become entrenched, you will actually slowly begin to go downward, and sometimes that's downward ethically towards poor moral choices within your organization. Sometimes it's just becoming so stuck in your ways that you miss opportunities for growth and revenue producing opportunities, things like that. So just be aware of that dynamic, that it's not just we as individuals functioning this way and thinking this way, but it actually happens every time a group gets together. And just like we as leaders have bounded awarenesses, and we as organizations have limited bandwidth and ability to process things, our customers and those we serve and our employees and others our constituents or our parishioners, whatever it may be, they are limited by the very same things. And so the research seems to indicate that limiting choices for those individuals is a way to serve them better and help them make better choices and produce a better relationship with your organization or ministry or whatever it may be. The conventional wisdom is often to offer lots of opportunities, lots of options, especially in the age of the internet, where we love lots of options. We like to go to Amazon and see 100 different choices of certain things, but you've probably been in that situation yourself where you search for something and you can't stand sorting through all of the different reviews and trying to figure out why is this one better than that one, and you finally just give up and you move on because you don't have time to make that choice today. And then maybe you never make that purchase. So we need to be aware of that, and it's tied to this bounded awareness concept. So as a leader, as a manager, it would be wise to purposefully, consciously seek a balance between numerous and actionable choices. And I say actionable choices to really just mean have a short enough list of choices that someone will actually take action, because that's what we're trying to do. Whatever business we're in or ministry we're in, we're trying to get people to do things to some degree. We're wanting them to make a choice, whether it's to purchase this new product or whether it's to attend this meeting or to support the organization with a donation. So it works in every type of organizational context when we sit back and think about this idea of limiting the choices so that people can take action right then, make a decision with enough informed information or enough valuable information, but not so much information that they are overwhelmed by it, because our brains simply cannot process an infinite volume of information. So hopefully these slides have helped you think a little more practically about the way to implement some of these concepts into your life and your role within whatever organization you find yourself in. And I encourage you to take part in those discussion boards again and give feedback. Practical examples are always helpful so that we can see how this plays out in an organizational setting or in a personal setting as well. And as we do this, remember in the book how it opened up with that discussion of Bernie Madoff, and that example shows up in lots of the literature and lots of the research out there on bounded awareness. And the basic point is that people should have been questioning his returns. There's no way anyone could have produced these kind of returns and promised these kind of returns without something shady going on. But people didn't want to see it, so they didn't see it. So avoid the Bernie Madoff situation in your life. Avoid people that function that way in your life. And of course, the answer to most of these problems that we've talked about, and it's repeated in this chapter as well, the answer is to stay humble. And as biblicists, we should be reminded all the time as we read God's Word of just how prone to error we are, and that ought to keep us humble. So be faithful in that, and as you're doing in this class, keep learning. The more you learn, the more you're aware of these things, the better opportunity you'll have to overcome these limitations and actually take advantage of the benefits of something like bounded awareness and see the blessing that God has designed in the way He has developed our brains. With that, we'll wrap it up for this week's lecture, and now you can turn your attention to the other supplemental videos. One of those videos will help you think through one of the illustrations in the textbook a little easier than it was to read it in just plain text, and I hope that will kind of reinforce the point for you. And so with that, I'll wrap it up and wish you a very blessed week.